I'd like to entitle my brief remarks Poesia e Sconfinamento, Without Roots, Poetry and Border Crossing. IPR has become a complex reality with editorial and advisory board members working on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, not only does it publish a rich annual issue, the present one is of 540 pages, it also organizes IPR Presents, consisting in presentations and readings in America and in Italy, and has started Ungarettiana, a new series of poetry and translations printed in Florence by Sef Editrice. Additionally, in conjunction with the Alinari Foundation of Florence, IPR now also sponsors the International Alinari Poetry Prize. In short, IPR is a journal striving to mirror the articulated situation of Italian poetry today, both inside and outside of Italy. In the present 2008 issue, among the 62 critics, authors, and translators, 25 are Italian poets, most of them young, presenting previously unpublished work or first translations of their poems, or who are being studied with a critical contribution or a review. One might think that a journal based in New York with the aim of presenting and studying Italian poetry represents a view from the margin. To the contrary, this is anything but the case, given the numerous and varied lists of poets and critics composing our most recent volume. Indeed, to observe the reality of Italian poetry from New York does not imply a condition of limitation at all. Rather, I believe that our work consists in speaking out of the margin, much as John Ashbery intimates with the verse, and I quote, "You spoke out of the margin," in his poem, "You Spoke as a Child." In other words, ours is not an experience of constraint, but on the contrary, an encounter of deep intellectual freedom, because by speaking out of the margin, we are trying redefine and expand what was previously assumed to be the core of Italian poetry. And by doing so, we are helping to create a new mood, to continue my allusion to Ashbery's aforementioned poem. And it seems to me that this new mood of Italian poetry has come about by crossing the margin or by border crossing, since more and more young authors write poetry nowadays which is less characterized by a geographical connotation. This is particularly true for some of the poets presented in the present issue of IPR. Even in the case of a poet like Franzin, who, although writing in dialect, describes a religious dialogue possible anywhere, and even with regard to Domenico Cipriano, whose poems addressing the earthquake of Avellino of 1980 can only be understood to have taken place in Avellino through the footnote which he attaches. Because the idea of border crossing appears to influence the works of many poets in the present issue of IPR, and also numerous poets writing in Italy today, it is worthy to study this trend with an eye towards comprehending poetry's relationship with, or its opposition to, the community in which it is generated. In his editorial to IPR 2007, Paolo Valesio addresses precisely this problem when he underscores the importance of engaging in a debate on, one, the relationship between the radicalization or the tendency toward the extreme of the poetic experience, which is frequently unstable, disordered, and erratic, and the profound need for radicamento, or the putting down of one's roots, that the poet feels, and two, the extent to which poetry helps in the process of community building if indeed the poet is less settled in his roots. With this in mind, if we read the present issue of the IPR 2008, we can say that among Italian poets, the radicalization of the poetic experience, well studied by Niva Lorenzini, among others, is matched by a progressively weaker experience of radicamento. As a consequence, it appears that the type of poetry defined by both geography and history, as Carlo Dionisotti described it, means increasingly less to this younger generation of poets, disproving, if we may, the principle stated by Goethe that he who wants to understand the poet must go to the land of the poet. In sum, the question which we must answer and which the present volume of IPR pushes us to address is the same one that Alessandro Carrera posed in the monthly review Poesia when he wrote, the real problem is, where do we truly live? Where does a poet live? In a country, in a city, in a neighborhood, or in some hidden place within the folds of his own writing? Poetry is the language of an invisible country. The poet's loss of roots is now, in my opinion, one of the key problems of contemporary writing and the future of poetry, and even its most vital present will consist in narrating the more or less conscious drama of this loss. Border crossing has become an inspiring motive for writing, and the anguish, joy, and contradictions caused by such a loss of roots has opened an invitation to poetry, contributing to the expansion of what we intend for Italian poetry. This enlarging of the scope of voices involved in creating a canon will, without doubt, result in much contradiction and multiplicity, inviting me to recall the following verses of Walt Whitman, with which I conclude. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Thank you.